that was beautiful, Emily. We're starting a 20-session Digging Up the Past series in Mount Barker on Friday, August 30. And Emily, I hope I can pinch you now and again to come up and play for us. Yeah. All right, well, this is our last session. We're going to talk about some of the amazing discoveries of biblical archaeology. There are a lot of them. It's hard to pick a top 7, really. If I was to pick a top 7, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls are going to be part of it, the Behistun Rock, these unlocked the languages. The Cyrus Cylinder, we've talked about that before, but I'm omitting those. But these are some of my favourites, and it's very, subjective, really. The top 7 discoveries of biblical archaeology. Not really the top 7, but my top 7. Okay? Now, I've read a book recently, and I'm very glad I was put onto this book. It was the archaeologist Michael Hazel that recommended it on one of his YouTube videos or something. And if you want to know about biblical archaeology, if it's an interest to you, then I would say get this book. Is Atheism Dead? The first third of the book talks about the evidence of intelligent design in the universe, and the last third deals with design in nature, the DNA and the cell and all this sort of stuff. But the middle third is dealing with the evidence of biblical archaeology, and it's very well written. You can easily understand it. He tells the story of the discoveries and so forth. I would recommend it to you. But in this book he says this: what we now call archaeology began in the 19th century, but did not become a serious discipline until the latter part of that century. So biblical archaeology is not very old. It's only been going 150 years or so. And the first evidence, or the first great discovery of in this top 7 I'd like to share with you, is the nation of the Hittites. The great kingdom of the Hittites. A lot of people don't know much about the Hittites, but they rivaled Egypt in power in their day. Between 1400 and 1200 BC, the Hittites established one of the great empires of the Middle East. Their empire extended from the Black Sea in the north to Damascus in Syria in the south, and over 1,000 kilometres from east to west in Anatolia or central Turkey. Yet this great, powerful nation, as it was, not only disappeared from history, but it was lost and forgotten so completely that the historians of the 19th century even denied their existence, because the only reference to them was in the Bible. The 1861 Encyclopaedia Britannica, under the subject Hittites, contained 8.5 lines in 1861. And if you read it carefully, it's simply a summary of what is found in the Bible, and not a very accurate summary even at that. Now, Eric Metaxas goes on and he says, as early 19th century scholars began to make their case against the historical accuracy of the Bible, the non-existence of the Hittites came to be Exhibit A. It was a big argument against the historicity of the Bible. So the historical records of the Bible, however, mention the Hittites at least 46 times. For example, in Genesis, this is in the late 19th century BC, Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I'm a foreigner and I'm a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. Now this was in northern Israel, and Abraham had to buy his burial site from the Hittites. And then you have also here in Genesis, Esau, a grandson of Abraham, when he was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and also Basmath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a source of grief to Isaac and Rebekah. So he disapproved of them. But here we have the 2 pagan Hittite women mentioned as well. And then in the 15th century BC, when the Israelites entered the Promised Land, they had to deal with certain people groups that were already settled in the land. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Marmites and the Vegemites. And the Promites. And the Mightymites. But notice in this list, the Hittites are mentioned first because they're the most powerful. In the 9th century BC, northern Israel was under siege by the king of Syria. The Syrian army then heard the sound of chariots and horses, and so they said, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and the Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled. Now, not only are the Hittites mentioned as striking terror into the hearts of the Syrian army, but they are mentioned first ahead of the Egyptian army. The point is, according to Bible history, the Hittites were a powerful nation equal to the Egyptians for hundreds of years, according to Bible history. Now we encounter perhaps the most famous Hittite in the story of King David's adultery with Bathsheba, who was then married to one of his officers known only as Uriah the Hittite in his army. So the Bible portrays the Hittites as a significant kingdom with great power stretching through the centuries. But because there was no evidence of the Hittite kingdom outside the Bible, many scholars denied their existence. The Hittites were just another Bible blunder, another evidence that the Bible history is just filled with myths and legends and fairy tales. And it's this backstory of disbelief and skepticism that has given the story of their rediscovery all the drama of a bestseller. By 1822, Jean-Francois Champollion had unlocked the mystery of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. So in the years that followed, scholars could read the hieroglyphic writing on the walls and on the temples. Now here on the south wall of the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, Ramesses is boasting about his victories over his enemies. And on the wall, it shows him riding forth doing battle with the Hatti people. The Hatti people. But who on all the earth were the Hatti people? Back in the mid-19th century, no one knew. And on a wall adjoining the south wall is the Egyptian account of a peace treaty between Ramesses and the Hatti. Obviously, the Hatti, whoever they were so powerful that the greatest pharaoh that ever lived could not conquer them, but had to settle for a peace treaty. Now, if you're wondering, are the Hatti people the Hittites mentioned 46 times in the Bible, you would be correct. But no one knew that in the 19th century. Now, the story really begins with the Swiss explorer John Burckhardt, who accidentally discovered Petra in 1812. And in 1809, while travelling through Syria, he passed through the city of Hamath, you can see here on the map. And when he went through this town of Hamath, he spotted some black basalt stones of great age in the foundation of a building. And on them was an inscription in some very strange-looking hieroglyphic language. Now, John Burckhardt, he died in 1817. But he kept a journal which was published in 1822 under the name Travels in Syria and the Holy Land. And in that publication, he said this: "In the corner of a house in the bazaar is a stone with a number of small figures and signs which appears to be a kind of hieroglyphic writing, though it does not resemble that of Egypt." Now, no one bothered to investigate or take any notice of what he saw. So some years went by, and in 1834, the French archaeologist Charles Texier was wandering through central Turkey, and he was looking for the lost Roman city of Tavium. And so he would go to a village and he would ask the people, are there any, do you know if there's any ruins round about? near a village called Bogeskoi, he was shown a very large area of ruins that he quickly realised were much, much older than Roman ruins. And what he saw stretched across some 450 acres. It was a massive ancient city. But what city was it? Who had built this great metropolis? There was no known ancient nation that fitted what he saw. He saw great walls and fortifications that extended for a large distance all around the city. And as he walked the perimeter of the wall, he saw monumental gates, one of which was flanked by these huge stone lions. And in Texier, he walked the entire perimeter of the Great Wall. It extended about 8 kilometres right around the city. But he wondered what great city had it contained. He was certain it must have been the capital of a great empire. But what empire? And who ruled here and when? A friendly Turk then led Texier to a valley, across a valley to a clump of large rocks just nearby the city. The place is known locally as Hezekiah. And he saw a bas-relief carved in the rock of a procession of godlike figures wearing peaked hats. Well, who were they? Were they soldiers? Were they gods? Texier was mystified. He had no idea. It was obvious that it was a rock-cut sanctuary, perhaps for the kings, maybe gods or the deities worshipped by this unknown kingdom. And on the reliefs, he also saw a strange hieroglyphic writing, totally different to what had been found in Egypt. He didn't know it then, but it was the same hieroglyphic writing that John Burkhardt had saw on these stones in northern Syria. Now, Texier didn't publish his account and his illustrations until 1862, nearly 3 decades later. Now, when Texier's account was finally published in 1862, a French archaeologist by the name of Georges Perrault travelled to Turkey to investigate the location that Texier and another archaeologist that followed Texier, Hamilton, had seen and written about. But Perrault found something that they didn't. It was a long inscription stretching 25 feet across, carved into the rock face, as you can see here. The locals call it Nishin Tan, or Nishin Tash, but again, they were bewildered. He was bewildered by the strange hieroglyphic writing. By 1873, more reliefs with strange hieroglyphics were being found across central Turkey, northern Syria, and elsewhere. Some as far west as even near Izmir in Turkey. Inscriptions and monuments were being found near Aleppo in northern Syria. And one wonders, how could any language or culture extend over 1,000 kilometres across from the Black Sea in the north to Damascus in the south, and yet somehow be altogether vanished from history? All these discoveries were coming, but no one knew anything about it or who they were. Well, William Wright now enters the picture. He had been studying the subjects for some time, and about 1873, he arrived at a very novel conclusion. He was an expert in one ancient document that the others were not, which had been ignored by all that had been involved in the mystery of this unknown kingdom. So Wright believed that the document he knew so well held the answer to this confounding question. And from his knowledge of the Bible, he stated that the unknown kingdom that they discovered all this inscriptions and so forth was that of the biblical Hittites. Well, they laughed him to scorn. He published his book, The Empire of the Hittites, in 1884. And about the same time that Wright was making his case for the Hittites, another individual enters the picture, and this is Archibald Henry Sayce, a famous archaeologist. He was a giant amongst the archaeologists of the time. He was already famous as a pioneer in deciphering the Assyrian cuneiform language. This man could read and write 20 modern and ancient languages. And he came to the same conclusion as Wright did. Now, as he studied the inscriptions, he also concluded that all the evidence pointed to the long-lost empire of the Hittites. He waited until 1880 and then he boldly declared before a meeting of the Society for Biblical Archaeology in London that all the evidence pointed to the Hittites of the Bible as the kingdom that they had discovered. Well, Wright and Sayce, they were attacked by the scholars at the time. They were called sarcastically the inventors of the Hittites. Ha ha ha. Look how silly those guys are. But they maintained their stance. Then in 1887, nearly 2,000 kilometres away, in Amarna, down in Egypt, hundreds of clay tablets were found in cuneiform writing, addressed to Pharaoh Akhenaten, the father of Tutankhamun. And one of the letters was from a king, Suppilulimus, who reigned from Anatolia or central Turkey. They read in these letters about numerous raids by the Hatti warriors, and there was also diplomatic letters from the king of the Hatti. Now the evidence was growing. They knew these Hatti was from central Turkey. And indeed, the evidence was pointing to the biblical Hittites. Well, then finally, in 1906, archaeologist Hugo Winkler was excavating at Hattusa near Bogascali, the same place that Texier had visited back in 1835, and they uncovered there an impressive hoard of over 10,000 clay tablets. And a year later, he uncovered another 10,000 tablets, what seemed like the entire royal archive of the city. And so by 1915, the Hittite cuneiform language, which is now called Luwian, was finally understood and could be read by scholars. And so the final evidence was in, confirming that this unknown kingdom was indeed the Hittite kingdom mentioned only in the Bible. But imagine their surprise when they began translating some of these tablets up there from Hattusa in the Akkadian cuneiform that they could read, and they found it was the Hittite version of the peace treaty with Ramesses the Great. And he had the peace treaty, his version of it down on the walls of the Karnak temple. And these inscriptions, by the way, are the earliest known international peace treaty in history. Hattusa, as we've mentioned, covered an area of 450 acres, and at its height had a population of 50,000 people. From the 15th to the 13th century BC, they were one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Middle East, rivaling that of Egypt. But for 3,000 years, they were lost to history, but not lost to Bible history. Scholars of the early 19th century scoffed at the Bible's mention of the Hittites, even denying their existence. Evolutionary geologist Professor George Frederick Wright admitted the following: the numerous references in the Bible to this mysterious people were unconfirmed by any other historical authorities, so that many regarded the biblical statements as mythical and an indication of the general untrustworthiness of biblical history. But as the discipline of archaeology emerged from the 19th century, so did the rediscovery of the great Hittite kingdom, which gave evidence that Bible history is accurate and trustworthy. Now that's the first one. Let's go now to our second discovery in the top 7 of biblical archaeology, and that is the discovery of Lachish reliefs. In 930 BC, the unified country of Israel split into two kingdoms, as we know. The northern kingdom was known as Israel, and the southern kingdom was known as Judah. And 200 years later, in 720 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the kingdom of Assyria that had their base in northern Iraq. Their capital was Nineveh. Now, with Israel destroyed, the Assyrian king Sennacherib now planned to destroy the southern kingdom of Judah. The prize of Judah would be, no doubt, the destruction of their capital, Jerusalem. So the Assyrian king launched a campaign to conquer southern Judah and to conquer Jerusalem. Judah, of course, knowing this was coming, had set up fortified military garrisons on the hilltops overlooking the valleys to protect the way up to Jerusalem. So you can basically see the route up to Jerusalem, and in this hill country, they call it the Shephelah, on every hill, most of them, they protected the route, the easiest route up to Jerusalem, with military fortresses. Now we know from Assyrian history outside the Bible that there was a king named Sennacherib, a Syrian king. His reign was from 704 to 681 BC. We also know that Sennacherib built a great palace at Nineveh on the Tigris River. So this is the site of Nineveh in Mosul, of northern Iraq today. And Sennacherib's palace is located there in that yellow circle. He actually called his palace, by the way, he big noted himself, it was called the Palace Without Rival. Well, it was certainly glorious. And the walls of some 70 rooms in this structure were carved limestone slabs covered with scenes that commemorated Sennacherib's royal exploits. So he had all these rooms with these scenes carved of his exploits. So people who came to visit the king would have to enter in through these rooms, and by the time they got to the king, they knew who they were dealing with. And for 2,500 years, they lay buried and forgotten. Well, in 1847, a British diplomat and amateur archaeologist by the name of Austin Henry Layard, another great archaeologist, discovered Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. And his discovery drew a huge amount of attention. Now, some of this stuff today is commonplace. People wander through the British Museum, they don't even know what they're looking at. But in the 19th century, this was front page news. This was big stuff. That there was a lot of interest as archaeology began to confirm things that were found in the Bible. Now, the focus of excitement of Layard's discovery of the palace of Sennacherib came from a room they labelled room number 26. Layard found the walls of this room covered with limestone, 8 feet tall and 80 feet long, wrapping all around the 4 walls. Every inch of the room's walls powerfully depicted only one scene in history: Sennacherib's defeat of the southern Judean kingdom's city of Lachish. Now, the artwork identifies itself as the Battle of Lachish. And here on a wall is shown Sennacherib on his throne celebrating his victory over Lachish. And by the way, do you see in the background all those dome-shaped objects in the background? They represent his soldiers, basically saying, I have a massive army and no one's going to conquer me. The immensity of the Assyrian army. Now here are the Assyrian archers showing their firing arrows and attacking Lachish. Here you can see the Assyrian siege ramps attacking the walls of Lachish. And they use these to try to breach the walls. A close-up of the siege ramps attacking the walls of Lachish. You can see them there, and the wall of Lachish in the middle, and the soldiers going up on ladders and so forth. In another scene, you have Judean prisoners of war pleading for mercy. But no mercy was given. Here's prisoners, Jewish prisoners of Lachish, being flayed alive. They got a knife and they're tearing strips of skin off them. In another scene was a pile of heads. They decapitated prisoners. Now this is the site of Tel Lachish in Israel, where the Assyrian siege took place in 720 BC. And this is this battle that took place here is what's depicted in this waiting room outside Sennacherib's throne room in his palace in Nineveh. Now here's an aerial view showing the main gate into Lachish. The first archaeological excavation here was conducted by a fellow James Starkey of the British Palestine Exploration Fund. It began in 1932, but came to an end in 1938, with Starkey being murdered by Arab militants who thought he was a Jew. Now archaeologists, they found there sling stones, arrowheads, spearheads used in the battle. And these sling stones, they're just not like a little pebble, they're the size a bit larger than a tennis ball, just like that. And they had this great big thing of leather and they swung it around like this and let it go, and if you get hit by one of these things, it'll take your head off. There's some of them there inside a hand. You know, these are big stones, sling stones, that were used in war. And when I visited Tel Lachish, you know, they've shown you where Sennacherib's army built a siege ramp up to the walls of Lachish and used his siege machines to breach the walls and so on. And it's still there today in a bit of ruin, but that's where they built up this wall. They had cover, you know, from the archers and all the rest of it, and they keep on laying stones to build up, and then they bring their siege ramps in and so on. You can almost just relive the whole lot. I felt like I was an Assyrian going to attack, you know. So the Assyrian army under King Sennacherib conquered Lachish, the second largest city of Judah. Now at the time of the siege of Lachish, King Hezekiah was ruling in Jerusalem. And so not only is this reliefs of the Battle of Lachish a famous thing, confirming biblical history, but there are other things relating to Hezekiah and Sennacherib that also confirm biblical history, and this brings us to our third top 7, the Taylor prism. Evidence for the existence of King Hezekiah was first discovered on this clay prism found in the city of Nineveh in 1830 by Colonel Robert Taylor, and hence it was called the Taylor prism. And it was remained in his possession, by the way. The British Museum only got it when his wife died, and she gave it. It was passed on to the British Museum. It's a hexagonal object of red baked clay covered with cuneiform writing. The trouble was, when this was found back in 1830, no one could read this. You know, they hadn't deciphered this cuneiform language at that time. Henry Rawlinson, who deciphered the Behistun rock, he made a squeeze of the prism back in 1835, but it wasn't until 1851 that he first published, he attempted a translation of it. But he still didn't know everything about how to translate this cuneiform at the time. Now later, 2 other clay prisms surfaced, and finally when they were all translated, they found that all 3 told basically the same story as of Sennacherib's invasion of Judah and his siege against King Hezekiah in Jerusalem. Now Sennacherib says on the Jerusalem prism, Hezekiah, king of Judah, I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, his walled forts, and to countless small villages. I besieged them and conquered them, and I made him a prisoner in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Now, he doesn't mention his victory over Lachish, but that was one of the 46 cities that he conquered. And all he says about Hezekiah is he locked him up as a bird in a cage in Jerusalem. Now, this created, you can imagine at the time, in the 19th century, there was a wave of skepticism about Bible history. But those who were Christians, when they were starting to get this information that was confirming Bible history, well, it just created, it was just pandemonium of excitement when it was discovered. Because the exact same story on these clay prisms and on the Lachish reliefs is also told in the Bible, this whole story of the siege of Sennacherib, the Lachish and Hezekiah and all that. It's in the Bible. So you have here in Isaiah 36, in the 14th year of the King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So what was written in Isaiah 36 and repeated in 2 Kings chapter 18 is basically the same as what was written on Sennacherib's clay prisms and dramatically illustrated in the Lachish reliefs that adorned a waiting room in Sennacherib's palace. So as these things came to light, it created a lot of excitement in the Christian world. Then the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh with a great army from Lachish to Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And he stood by the aqueduct from the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field. So after conquering the fortified cities of Judah, Sennacherib then sets his eyes on Jerusalem, the prize that he really wants. And so he sent his army from Lachish up to Jerusalem. to attack Hezekiah up there. So King Hezekiah, he tries to get out of trouble by offering tribute to King Sennacherib. And so you read it here. Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish: I have done wrong. Please withdraw from me and I'll pay you whatever you demand. Just go away. So the king of Assyria, it says, exacted from Hezekiah, the king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And then the response of Hezekiah is, so Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace. Now the amazing thing is that this tribute paid by Hezekiah is also recorded on Sennacherib's clay prisms as well. So from the Taylor prism, it says, fear of my greatness terrified Hezekiah, and he sent to me tribute, 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, precious stones, ivory, and all sorts of gifts, including women from his palace. Now here we see a direct correspondence between the biblical account and Sennacherib's records. Now, by the way, it says 30 talents of gold were requested, as per 2 Kings 18, verse 14, and that's exactly what he received on the prism. That's what he says. However, the Bible states that 300 talents of silver were requested, but Sennacherib's inscription states he received 800 talents of silver. How so? Well, the Bible says Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the temple of the Lord, so he gave him more than what he asked for to hopefully, get him to go away. So these clay prisms of Sennacherib are a tremendous discovery to confirm the exact same historical account as revealed in the Bible. And so, in my opinion, they deserve a place in my top 7 discoveries of biblical archaeology. Now, a message is sent to Hezekiah from the Assyrians. Do not let Hezekiah mislead you when he says the Lord will deliver us. Have the gods of any nations delivered their lands from the hand of the king of Assyria? Now, so the Assyrian army is now outside the walls of Jerusalem, and as a result of that, Hezekiah goes into the temple to pray for help. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and he spread it out, the whole issue, these letters that are coming from the Assyrians, and Hezekiah prayed to the Lord. Now the answer to his desperate prayer came through the prophet Isaiah. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor will he come before it with a shield, nor will he build a siege mound against it, like he did down at Lachish. And by the way that he came, the same he'll return, and he will not come into the city, says the Lord, for I will defend the city, to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. And we know what happened. In the Bible, it says the angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when the people arose early in the morning, they were all corpses. They were all dead. Now, it's very interesting that the fascinating fact is that King Sennacherib never boasts about destroying Jerusalem on his clay prisms. The clay prisms say he made Hezekiah a prisoner, like a bird in his cage. Now listen, if you wanted to boast about your greatness to people visiting your palace, you would certainly boast about the destruction of Jerusalem, wouldn't you? Not some little city down the hills there, Lachish. But he never boasts about that because he never destroyed it. What happened was his army was destroyed outside Jerusalem. So you have a correlation between the Bible story and the secular history recorded by the Assyrians. So what's the significance of the discovery of the Lachish reliefs and these 3 clay prisms? Well, not only are Sennacherib and Hezekiah mentioned in the Bible, confirmed outside the Bible, but the discovery of the Lachish reliefs and the 3 prisms confirms Judah as a powerful, important nation in the 8th century BC. You don't brag about a victory over a weak, insignificant opponent. Now, some scholars say that Israel were just a bunch of cow herders back at that time, but not so according to these discoveries. No one is impressed if you steal candy from a baby, but they're impressed if you've overthrown a big kingdom, sort of thing. Now, secondly, Sennacherib uses 8 feet by 80 feet of wall in a waiting room in his palace to brag about destroying Lachish. Why didn't he use that space to brag about destroying Jerusalem? Jerusalem would have been the number one prize to brag about. Lachish is regarded as the second most important city of Judah behind Jerusalem, but destroying Jerusalem would have sent a message throughout the then known world that the God of Assyria is greater than the God of Israel. But the fact is, Sennacherib didn't destroy Jerusalem. The Bible account is accurate. Lachish was destroyed, not Jerusalem. And thirdly, the destruction of Lachish is the most widely documented event from the Old Testament. 4 independent sources tell the story. The Bible tells the story of this historical incident. In the Assyrian cuneiform prisms is the story parallel to the Bible, the excavations at Lachish, and the Lachish reliefs in the British Museum. So the Lachish reliefs and the clay prisms are definitely top 7 items in the discoveries of biblical archaeology. So when we read the history contained in the Bible, the evidence outside the Bible tells us we are not reading myths, fables, and legends, but accurate history of what actually took place. So let's come to the next one, and again, it's associated with Hezekiah, and that is Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem. Anyone been to Jerusalem and walked through the tunnel? I've been there 3 times, and it was only the 3rd time that I got through the tunnel. I could tell you some stories about that. Well, how did King Hezekiah now prepare for the Assyrian invasion? Now, he knew it was coming. He knew these Assyrian army was coming, and so he had plenty of time to prepare, and he didn't sit around doing nothing. He prepared. Now, the Bible says the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and all his might, and how he made a pool and a tunnel and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Then it says, after all that Hezekiah had so faithfully done, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah. And he laid siege to the fortified cities, thinking to conquer them for himself. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, that he had intended to wage war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and his military staff about blocking off the water from the springs outside the city, and they helped him. Now, why would they have a siege around the city and allow them to have the water? So they blocked off all the springs and make it difficult for them. He blocked up the upper spring of Gihon and brought the water down through a tunnel to the west side of the city of David. And so he succeeded in everything that he did. The Bible tells us he built a tunnel, blocked off that spring, and brought the water inside the city. Now today, you can visit Jerusalem, and you can go down and to the excavated site of what they call the City of David, and you can walk through this tunnel that he had his men build in the 7th century BC. So back in 2019, we descended into the tunnel. The length of the tunnel is 533 metres, or it's 1,749 feet from the Gihon spring, which was blocked up by Hezekiah, to the pool of Siloam, which was inside the city. Now, Hezekiah built this tunnel in preparation for the Assyrian invasion, to keep the water inside the city. And I tell you what, it's a great experience to walk through this tunnel. It follows a gradual descent, just enough to keep the water flowing downward. Marvellous engineering over such a long distance. And it wasn't until 1880 that this tunnel was confirmed to have been built by Hezekiah in preparation for the Assyrian siege. Now, we knew it from the Bible that there was a tunnel built, but there's nothing outside the Bible until 1880 to confirm that. And a teenager by the name of Jacob Eliahu Spatford, playing hooky from school one day, he got a mate back in 1880, they knew of the tunnel, they said, let's go through it. And he said to his mate, you go to the other end and I'll start at this end and we'll meet in the middle. And they had a candle, and off they went. Well, his friend got a bit scared, a little way into the tunnel, so he backed out and got out of there. And little Jacob, he had to keep going, And he was only about 18 feet into the tunnel when he fell over in the water. Now, it's all been excavated now, rubble and debris, and so the level to the ceiling was pretty low, and he fell over in the water, and as he was trying to pick himself up, he looked, and just at the water line, he saw what appeared to be an inscription in the rock, cut into the limestone wall. So he reported it to his teacher, and some months later, the Assyriologist Dr. Archibald Sayce, who was then in Jerusalem, identified the writing as an old form of Hebrew of the 8th and 7th century BC. And so with that discovery of the Siloam inscription in the tunnel there, it confirmed this was Hezekiah's tunnel that the Bible had spoken about. The original Siloam inscription is today in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and it records how the builders built the tunnel by starting at each end and finally meeting in the middle. Now the tunnel, it just twists and turns like a snake through 1,750 feet, but miraculously, the two teams of diggers that started at each end, they met near the middle and they heard the sound of their picks. They're only 4 feet apart. And then they just joined up and the tunnel was then made. Now the water comes out here from the Gihon spring, it flows through the tunnel and it exits here. And it comes down to the site of the newly discovered pool of Siloam that was originally built by King Hezekiah. Now, when previous visits I've been there, this site was covered with a bit of an olive grove and so on, but they've bought the land and they've excavated the site. They found the steps you can see in the right-hand corner, the steps leading down into the pool, and they hope to find the steps on the other side or a corner, but they haven't found anything on the other side. But their plans are to reconstruct the pool of Siloam, where you have the stories of the New Testament and so forth, took place here. So from the pool of Siloam, there was an ascending stairway, as the inset picture shows, going up to the Temple Mount. So people have their ritual, bathing here and go up. So again, you have from Chronicles, he blocked up Hezekiah, the upper spring Gihon. He brought water down through a tunnel to the west side of the city of David. So this is another great witness to the accuracy of Bible history and the truthfulness of a specific Bible text, that text right there. Now, number 5 in our top 7 is Hezekiah, another one with Hezekiah, his seal impression, discovered relatively recently. This bulla, it's a seal impression like a signet ring pressed into clay. It's only little, about a centimetre round, as you can see an example maybe of a signet ring. And they found it here in the Ophel excavations, found by a team from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, directed by the late archaeologist lady, Dr. Elia Mazar. And it was found here at this, what was believed to be a sort of a bit of a dump outside a wall that surrounds Jerusalem's old city. And it's believed that this bulla, they'd have documents that were sealed and they'd open the documents and all this rubbish, toss it out the window. And so they found it later on. And this was recorded in BBC and New York Times, Washington Post, all around the world. Impression of biblical king's seal found in Jerusalem. It says, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. And it was reported everywhere. It was big news at the time. Impression of King Hezekiah's royal seal discovered in excavations in Jerusalem. And it says here, this is the first seal impression of an Israelite or a Judean king to come to light in a scientific archaeological excavation. Other seals had come, but they come through, private antiquities dealers, but this was found in an organised archaeological dig, and it was found and it has good provenance and so forth. Dr. Elat Mazar. She said, "It was the closest we can ever get to something that was held by King Hezekiah himself." And it's true, he would have had to put his signet ring in it. It was found here outside what was Solomon's Gate into the city. And the uniqueness of the seal impression announced is because it was, one of the things it does, it indicates that Jerusalem housed a royal administration in the 8th century BC. Again, proving that this wasn't a bunch of cow herders on a hill, but it was a royal kingdom ruled by kings and so forth. Now we come to number 6, the black obelisk of the Assyrian King Shalmaneser III. This is one of my favourites. In December of 1846, Sir Austin Henry Layard was excavating at Nimrud, which is about 38 kilometres south of Mosul, near the Tigris River. And his workmen wanted to shut things down. It was too cold, too cold. The ground was hard. It made digging trenches very difficult. But Layard persuaded his men to dig one more day. And no sooner had they returned to work when the workman's tool struck something hard. Now what they found was an astounding black limestone stele in the form of an obelisk, and its 4 sides with 5 registers of relief sculptures there. It was from the 9th century BC and pictured the Assyrian King Shalmaneser III, who reigned from 858 to 824 BC. And in the images, he was shown to be receiving tribute from a number of defeated subjects, beneath which there was this Akkadian cuneiform writing. Now in 1846, the cuneiform writing was only just beginning to be deciphered, so no one really knew what the writing said. The pictures showed 2 kings prostrating themselves before Shalmaneser, with others following, carrying items of tribute. Now all this, had to be shipped off to London. And I tell you what, getting stuff from that archaeological site to London was not an easy task back there in the mid-19th century. It had to go 500 kilometres by river raft down to Baghdad, and actually some of these things, the raft sunk and some of their things just went to the bottom of the Tigris. Well, it took 2 months and another 400 plus kilometres to get down to the port of Basra, and then by ship it had to go to Bombay in India and Calcutta before meeting a ship to sail back to England. In all, it took 2 years for the goods to get back there, and the whole story of that shipment is interesting to read about it as well. Now, while it was in Baghdad, Henry Rawlinson was there. He was deciphering cuneiform. Not completely understood, but he had a go at deciphering it based on his knowledge at that time. He said the second line of offerings are said to have been sent by Yahuwah, son of Hubiri, a prince of whom there was no mention in the annals, and of whose native country, therefore, I am ignorant. That's what he said at the time. Well, finally, after an enormous journey taking 2 years, in 1848 it finally arrived in London and was given pride of place in the British Museum. And this thing became a sensation in London. Thousands flocked to the museum to see this thing, even though they didn't know what it said. But this was something great. It came out of Assyria, and they all wanted to have a look at it. Now, in 1851, cuneiform had been better understood, and Edward Hincks, an Assyriologist himself, came to the museum and had a look at the inscription, and he realised, hang on a minute, what Layard had published those years before is not exactly correct translation that he did back in 1847. He said the figure kneeling before the Assyrian King Shalmaneser II was not some character called Yahuwah, son of Hubiri, but Jehu, son of Omri. Well, the identification of King Jehu, son of Omri, struck a thunderous blow to all those who thought the Bible was the stuff of myth and fable. Now, by the way, at this time when this was discovered, This was the first archaeological discovery that confirmed something in the Bible. So it was pandemonium, you can imagine. Everyone in England wanted to see the thing. And over the next number of decades, more astounding discoveries would be made. And so definitely this famous black obelisk showing King Jehu bowing before Shalmaneser is a definitely top 7 item in biblical archaeology. And our last now is the famous discovery of the Moabite stone, or the Mesha stele, in Jordan. Now, it's impossible to overstate, really, the excitement caused by the identification of Jehu on the black obelisk of 1851. And you've got to realise how exciting these things were, because liberal scholars at the time were saying the Bible is a book of myths and fairy tales. And now archaeology is born, and at the time when all this scepticism, now they're seeing these historical statements of the Bible being verified from the discoveries of being brought forth from archaeology. Well, you can't overestimate the excitement of this black obelisk. In the same way, it's impossible to exaggerate the pandemonium in 1868 over what is called the Moabite stone, or the Mesha stele. Its discovery and the subsequent corroboration of what it said in Old Hebrew with a specific passage from the Bible was simply astonishing and unprecedented at the time. Now, unlike the black obelisk of Shalmaneser, that was the first discovery to confirm the existence of a biblical king, that is Jehu, this discovery actually confirmed a specific Bible historical, some texts of history. And following its discovery, there was great excitement in England and in the Christian nations, France and Germany, for more archaeological discovery. They all wanted to find these treasures that were supporting the Bible. Now, the story starts with Frederick Augustus Klein, a German-born Anglican missionary who had settled in Jerusalem sometime in the mid-19th century. Now, Klein had learned Arabic and often travelled east to the dangerous area of Jordan. He was a kind man, and he had gained the trust of the Bedouin tribes. And on one occasion, he was visiting the Bani Hamada Bedouins, who lived in their tents near what was the capital of the Moabite kingdom some 3,000 years ago. So while Klein was here, the locals told him of a remarkable ancient stone with an inscription on it. And so they took him to have a look. So here is the location of ancient Dibon in Jordan. You can see just east of the Dead Sea there, and the site as it is there today. So when Klein first saw the stone, he knew immediately that this was a very significant discovery. It was a black basalt stele, about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, and it had 34 lines in what looked like an old Hebrew writing. But Klein couldn't read it, but he knew he must try and negotiate with the Bedouins to buy it. Well, they set a big price on it, which in no way he could pay. He didn't have that sort of money on him. So Klein made a quick sketch of the stone, which you can see inset, and he copied some of the characters, and he returned to Jerusalem to raise the money. Now, Klein informed Heinrich Petermann, he was the Prussian consul there at the time. He knew the German government would be beside themselves to get this prize for their Berlin museum. And they telegraphed Klein, look, you just will provide the money, you get the thing as soon as possible, we want it. But the trouble was that the Bedouins now knew the stone was worth a bit of money. And someone had leaked some information out, and now the French and the English now entered the scene, and so you had the 3 great European powers all clamouring to get their hands on the thing. Now we now know that the writing was a Canaanite Paleo-Hebrew, and that the writing actually recounted events from a passage in the 3rd chapter of 2 Kings. Now here it is in 2 Kings. Now Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder, and he regularly paid the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But it happened when Ahab died that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. Now, here's a partial translation of the Moabite song. I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, the king of Moab, the Dibonite. As for Omri, the king of Israel, he humbled Moab for many years, extorted tribute and so forth. And his son Ahab reigned in his place. And he also said, I'll oppress Moab. But I triumphed over him and over his house, and Israel has perished. Because when Ahab died, he rebelled, as the Bible also indicated. Now, the inscription also mentions the name of Yahweh, the Hebrew name of God in the Bible. It refers to the kingdom of Israel and to the king of Israel, Omri. It also refers to Omri's son, King Ahab. It also mentions that Mesha went north to Ataroth, which was inhabited at the time by the Israelite tribe of Gad. And he killed the entire population, it says on the stone. Then he said he attacked Nebo and killed everyone, 7,000 people, men, boys, girls, and pregnant women. He got after them all. So you have all these biblical things, and we know the tribe of Gad was in this area, and it says how he attacked them and so forth. It says here in the Mesha Stele, the men of Gad dwelt in the land of Ataroth, and from ancient times, and the king of Israel had built Ataroth, but I fought against the city, and I took it, and I killed the entire population. Now, a French amateur archaeologist by the name of Charles Clermont Ganneau, he was a linguist, and he was very, very keen to get hold of this inscription. But it was too dangerous now for himself to go, so he sent an Arab by the name of Karavakar and 2 other Arabs over to the Bedouins to see if they could negotiate and get permission to make a paper squeeze impression of the entire inscription. They used to do that in back of those days. It was like paper mache. They'd press it on, wait for it to dry, pull it off, and they had a reverse copy of the inscription. Well, they got permission to do so, but before the squeeze could dry, the situation just exploded into violence. Now, we don't know exactly what happened, but Karavaka, he suffered a spear wound to his face, and one of the other men suffered a wound to the leg. So, they realised, look, they better get out of here quick, smart. So Karavaka's unwounded companion, he managed to pull the squeeze, the still wet squeeze, from the inscription, but unfortunately he tore it into 7 pieces. He shoved it into his robe. They all jumped on their horses and they galloped away with the squeeze in several pieces, but their lives intact. Now, arriving back in Jerusalem, Ganneau finally got the torn squeeze that nearly cost the 3 Arabs their lives. Now, bartering was going on now by the European powers who were all eager to get the stone. But by November in 1869, the Ottoman Turks, who controlled the area, they were ready to dispatch soldiers and take the stone by force. But the Bedouins, they hated the Turks, the Bedouins. So rather than have the despised Turks take the stone, they decided to do something really, really, really radical. They lit a roaring bonfire around the stone, and they brought this priceless treasure to such a temperature that when they poured cold water on it, it did exactly as they expected. It cracked and broke into about 100 pieces. And by using other stones, they smashed it apart into all these pieces. And those pieces were then distributed among the families of the tribe. Now, when news of this got back to Jerusalem, everyone was absolutely just devastated, none more so than Ganneau. And however, he was absolutely determined at all costs to get the inscription. While the other European powers bowed out, he still, tried to get hold of whatever he could. So he bravely returned to the Bedouins, and eventually, long story short, 56 pieces of shattered stone were purchased. And with the torn squeeze that Ganneau that they had made, they were able to reconstruct the missing portions. So I visited the Louvre in Paris, and there it is today, reconstructed from the little bits of the torn squeeze and so on. So this amazing stone presented to the world spectacular evidence that what was found in the Bible could be confirmed outside the Bible. It is one of the great discoveries of biblical archaeology, showing from the Moabite perspective the very events recorded in 2 Kings chapter 3. And this is a powerful witness that Bible history is not a collection of myths, fables and legends, but it contains reliable, accurate history, and this one in particular dating back to the 8th century BC. Do you know 53 people in the Bible have been confirmed outside the Bible through archaeology? Just to finish off, W.F. Albright, who was a giant in Middle East archaeology, he said, "During these 15 years, my initially rather sceptical attitude toward the accuracy of the Israelite historical tradition has suffered repeated jolts as discovery after discovery confirmed the historicity of the details which might reasonably have been considered legendary at the time." But the evidence turned his mind around. And let me repeat Dr. Nelson Glueck, who was an American born of Jewish parents, expert archaeologist and so forth. He said, "No archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference," and his statement remains true to this very day. Scores of archaeological findings which have been made which confirm in clear outline or in exact detail the historical statements of the Bible. I find it mind-boggling. I love studying this stuff. I love studying Bible prophecy because it gives me a solid platform of evidence for me to trust the Bible in every detail of it. It's historically accurate and it's prophetically accurate at too. Biblical archaeology that confirms biblical history plus the power of biblical prophecy is what has helped me build a solid foundation of evidence upon which I can build a confident and lasting faith. And I hope it does so for you too. And then as you share with others, you can share the solid foundation of why the Bible can be trusted with people. Well, I hope whatever our faith has been to date, that you might have your faith built up a little by these 5 meetings and encouraged and affirmed by the amazing discoveries of biblical archaeology, history and prophecy. It's been a pleasure sharing these 5 meetings with you. God bless you all.